In the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio, where the Hawking River winds through quiet, forgotten valleys, stands an old, weathered stone marker. Most locals avoid it once the sun goes down. The inscription, worn nearly smooth by time and harsh winters, reads simply, New Canaan Community Farm, 1837 to 1863. In God's grace we trust. But it says nothing of the 230 for people who died there or why the old Coleman barn still echoes at night with sounds no one can explain. For more than 150 years, the people of Athens County have kept this story quiet, passing it down only in hushed tones. Tonight, for the first time, the full story of Elder Daniel Coleman and his family's 26-year grip over New Canaan will be told. It's a truth that forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about faith, family, and life on the early American frontier. Before we dive into the story of the Coleman family and the community they built, one that promised salvation but delivered suffering, ask yourself, are you ready for one of the darkest chapters in American history? This channel isn't for everyone. It's for those willing to face the truths others would rather ignore. If you're ready to go deeper, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which state you're watching from. Because what happened in Ohio could have happened anywhere on the American frontier. Let's uncover what lies beneath the surface of our forgotten past. The year was 1837. Across the country, people were seeking salvation. The Second Great Awakening had swept across the frontier, stirring thousands to search for deeper spiritual meaning. In Athens County, Ohio, the winter of 1837 found a land caught between progress and wilderness. Trade along the Ohio River brought some wealth, but many areas remained isolated, quiet, forested, and filled with secrets. Tucked into a secluded valley, Elder Daniel Coleman discovered 400 acres that would become his personal stronghold. He was a commanding man, tall, intense blue eyes, and a voice that could both inspire and intimidate. At 42, he'd already buried 2 wives and claimed to receive visions from God. His current wife, Sarah, whom he called Mother Sarah, in public was 20 years younger, but held a sternness that made her seem much older. Their children, Joshua, 16, Rebecca, 14, and Ezra, 12, had been raised to see their father not just as a parent, but as a divine messenger. The Colemans said they had fled religious persecution in Pennsylvania, arriving in Athens County with a wagon full of gold. Daniel's story was compelling. He spoke of corrupt churches and failed communities, and of a calling from God to create a new Eden. He paid for the land in cash, which raised some eyebrows, but locals were quick to overlook it when he started offering jobs to anyone willing to work the land. The property was ideal. A brick house stood on a hill overlooking rich farmland, thick woods, and a year-round stream. Most importantly, it was isolated, surrounded by forest that would mask any sounds from reaching nearby farms. Within months, Coleman began advertising across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The message was simple: join New Canaan Community Farm, where Christian families live together in faith, free from worldly possessions, and devoted to God. His promises of shared living, spiritual unity, and guaranteed salvation attracted immediate interest. By spring 1838, families began arriving. The Hendersons came from Pennsylvania. The Millers followed, then the Washingtons, the Thompsons, and the Prices. Each was greeted warmly by Elder Coleman, whose passion and authority could sway even the most skeptical. But these families were walking into a trap one Coleman had carefully designed. He had spent years learning how to manipulate desperate people and turn faith into a tool for control. New Canaan was no sanctuary. It was a labor camp in disguise, and the Colemans were its ruthless overseers. At first, things seemed to live up to the promise. Families built cabins, ate in a shared dining hall, and gathered for evening prayers. The work was hard, but felt purposeful. Coleman worked beside them, quoting scripture and speaking of the early Christian communities that lived in unity. But slowly, changes crept in. Workdays stretched longer, meals grew smaller, punishments became harsher. Coleman explained it as a form of spiritual discipline. The flesh must weaken, he would say, so the spirit may grow strong. Anyone who questioned him was forced to confess their doubts in front of the entire community. The first death came that fall just 6 months after the group had arrived. Thomas Henderson collapsed while clearing stumps. Coleman recorded the cause as heart failure brought on by spiritual joy. But his widow, Martha, quietly told her children their father had been working 16-hour days on nothing but soup and bread. His funeral was held at sunset, and Coleman gave a sermon that lasted nearly 3 hours. "Brother Thomas has gone home," he declared. "We must follow his example of full surrender." As winter deepened, the cracks in Coleman's vision widened. The Colemans remained strong and well-fed while others struggled. They dined separately in the main house, always had clean clothes, and never seemed to share in the community's exhaustion. People sleeping nearby began to hear sounds at night: laughter, music, and clinking dishes, strange for a family that preached humility. When asked, Coleman gave his usual answer: spiritual rewards came only to the truly faithful. In December, Mary Washington was found frozen in her bed. Her family had run out of firewood, and their request for more had been denied by Joshua Coleman. "Sister Mary has been taken by the Lord's mercy," Daniel said at her funeral. "She has been spared the trials that await us." By the end of that first winter, 7 people were dead. Coleman called each death God's will, using every funeral to tighten his hold over those who remained. Community members weren't allowed to contact the outside world. Letters were filtered by Rebecca Coleman, who said she was protecting the group from corrupt influences. But it was 14-year-old Peter Miller who uncovered the truth. While cleaning the root cellar, he discovered a hidden stash of watches, jewelry, family Bibles, and photographs, items that should have gone to loved ones, not hidden away beneath the Coleman house. When Peter brought it to Daniel's attention, he was told he needed spiritual cleansing. That night, Peter vanished. The official story was that he ran away, but his mother found blood outside his cabin, and she knew better. The pattern was now undeniable. New Canaan wasn't a community, it was a prison. The Colemans grew wealthy as their followers were worked to death or simply disappeared. But escape was nearly impossible. The nearest town was 15 miles through thick woods, and Coleman had convinced everyone that the outside world was filled with demons, ready to destroy their souls. By early 1839, the survivors were stuck in a daily cycle of backbreaking labor and spiritual pressure that would continue for the next 24 years. The community grew to over 100 members. New families continued to arrive, drawn by promises of salvation. But the death toll kept rising. Those who survived wore a haunted expression, shaped by what they had seen and what they dared not say. The Colemans ruled with absolute authority. Elder Daniel was the undisputed leader, his word considered divine. Sarah oversaw the women, managing domestic life with a cruelty that left lasting scars. Joshua handled supplies and labor assignments. Rebecca, now 15, acted as her father's secretary and quietly enforced his rules. Even young Ezra, at 13, was being trained to carry the family legacy forward. The main house grew larger, with new additions to hold Coleman's office and private meeting rooms. The original section became the family's personal living space. The basement was said to store food, but many whispered about the screams that sometimes came from beneath the ground. Work began before dawn. A bell rang at 4 a.m., and by 4:30, everyone was at their posts, men in the fields, women in the kitchens, children as young as 8 assigned to whatever jobs they could handle. Meals were short and sparse, but it was the nightly instruction that truly showcased Coleman's control. Every evening, the entire group gathered to hear his sermons, blending scripture with his own dark interpretations. People were forced to confess their failures in front of everyone, begging for forgiveness. Those who resisted the system didn't last long. Some were sent to missionary work and never returned. Others simply vanished. The reasons given always varied, but the signs were the same: a private meeting, a sudden change in assignments, a name repeated during evening service, and then silence. The children born into the community faced on take whatever wealth they could carry as proof of the Coleman family's crimes. Then, using a hidden trail through the woods that Chen had mapped out during supply runs, they would Lead as many families as possible to safety under cover of night. The plan required precise coordination and absolute secrecy. Any slip could mean death for themselves and the hundreds they hoped to save. Anna Thompson took on the most dangerous task, spreading quiet warnings to the newest rivals. Disguised as welcome visits, she used subtle cues to test who might be trusted. Some were too frightened or too loyal to Coleman to be swayed. Others, particularly those who had already begun to suspect something was wrong, agreed to join the effort. Meanwhile, Margaret Foster used her kitchen duties to prepare a large batch of antidotes, brewed from herbs gathered secretly by Sarah Martinez and others who worked the gardens. The goal wasn't just to escape, but to survive the poisoned food planned for the spring festival. David Chen created false floorboards and hollow beams to hide both supplies and evidence. Every night, under the cover of darkness, they moved closer to readiness. When the first week of April arrived, the air around the New Canaan community farm seemed charged with tension. Coleman and his children were more watchful than usual. Ezra patrolled the grounds late into the night. Rebecca spoke less in public, her usual icy calm replaced by sharp glances and whispered conversations. The festival began as planned. Bright banners hung from the main hall, children practiced songs, and tables were set for a feast that masked deadly intent. But the conspirators were ready. On the night before the main gathering, they made their move. Chen led a small team into the basement, using a hidden latch beneath the pulpit in the main hall. What they found confirmed everything: crates of stolen belongings, journals from past victims, and ledgers documenting years of theft and death. Meanwhile, Anna and Sarah moved through the cabins, delivering the antidote disguised as a special festival tonic. Shortly before dawn, just hours before the poisoned food was to be served, Anna lit the first signal fire near the edge of the woods. It was the sign to begin the escape. In small, scattered groups, families began slipping into the forest trail mapped by Chen. The sick and elderly were carried on makeshift stretchers. Children were hushed and held close, but the Colemans were not easily fooled. When Rebecca noticed several cabins standing empty, she raised the alarm. Ezra, already unhinged, ran into the woods with a torch, screaming threats and firing blindly into the trees. But the conspirators had timed everything perfectly. The confusion, the darkness, and the terrain were on their side. By morning, nearly 150 people had escaped. The fires set by Coleman to cover their crimes now burned out of control. What was left of New Canaan smoldered in the valley, as frightened survivors staggered into nearby towns with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the truth they had carried for years. The authorities were skeptical at first. Stories of torture, mass graves, and religious manipulation were hard to believe. But the evidence David Chen's team had recovered was undeniable. Journals, gold coins stamped with dates from a dozen states, poisoned food samples, and most damning of all, the ledger that documented every rival and every death. News of the raid spread quickly, and warrants were issued for Daniel Coleman and his family. But they were gone. By the time lawmen reached the ruins of New Canaan, the Coleman family had vanished. No bodies, no sign of their escape route. Some believed they had fled to one of the other communities they had secretly established. Others thought they had perished in the fire, but no remains were ever found. What's left of New Canaan is little more than ruins and legend, a quiet valley marked by a forgotten stone and whispered warnings. But the survivors carried their story with them. They settled in other parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and beyond, and for generations passed down the truth of what really happened behind the walls of a place that promised heaven and delivered something far worse. It took years before law enforcement connected the Colemans to similar operations in Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee. All were shut down, but the family was never captured. Some say descendants of Daniel Coleman still live under different names, carrying on the legacy in quieter ways. Others believe the family was cursed, doomed to wander as shadows of what they once were. What we know is this: New Canaan was not an isolated horror. It was a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, blind faith, and the silence that allows evil to thrive. And though time has buried much of that past, the echoes remain for those willing to listen. The plan was clear: gather proof of the family's crimes, take enough of their hidden wealth to fund an escape, and use the chaos of the upcoming festival as cover to help as many people flee as possible. Then they would head for the nearest town and alert the authorities. But just as they were preparing to act, they discovered something alarming. They weren't the only ones keeping secrets. The Coleman family had been watching more closely than they realized, and a trap was already in motion. The pressure was building fast, and time was running out. In just 2 weeks, the spring festival would begin, and with it, the Colemans planned to wipe out everyone who could expose them. At that point, it wasn't just about escape, it was about saving whoever they could before it was too late. The night of April 5, 1852, would become one of the darkest in Athens County's history. The festival had kicked off 3 days earlier, filled with sermons, songs, and celebrations that promised spiritual renewal. But as the sun went down that evening, Anna Thompson and the others knew they were heading into something far more dangerous. The Coleman family had been acting off all wake. Daniel's usual confidence seemed strained, his sermons less inspiring and more erratic. Sarah Coleman was seen burning stacks of paper in the main house, while Rebecca and Joshua moved through the community with a tense, frantic energy. Ezra was the most unsettling, sharpening blades in the workshop, with the look of someone barely holding himself together. That evening's final feast was set to take place in the main hall, and Coleman had promised it would be transformative. But Anna and her group knew the real plan. The food would be laced with poison, wiping out most of the community in one night. Throughout the day, they made final preparations, gathering what they could, warning trusted members, and taking positions. As the sun dipped below the hills, the plan went into motion. While the community gathered in the hall, Anna Thompson and David Chen made their way into the basement beneath the Coleman house. Their mission was to gather evidence and, if possible, enough stolen wealth to help the survivors start fresh. At the same time, Margaret Foster and Sarah Martinez quietly positioned themselves by the exits, ready to move once the first sign of trouble appeared. What Anna and David found in the basement was worse than they expected. Crates lined the walls filled with the stolen belongings of those who had died: wedding bands, family photographs, children's toys, fragments of lives that had been cut short. In the main chamber sat an open safe filled with gold coins and jewelry, the accumulated life savings of hundreds. But in a side room, lit only by candlelight, they found something far more disturbing: meticulous records of every person who had ever arrived at New Canaan. Names, family details, belongings, and most horrifying, how they were eliminated. The files went back over 15 years and listed not just the Ohio site, but similar operations in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky. The worst revelation? Some victims hadn't been killed. They'd been sold. Women and children who resisted were drugged, loaded into wagons, and sold into slavery. Over 60 names appeared in the files, with family members told they had died of illness. As Anna and David scrambled to collect what they could, footsteps echoed from above. Then came the unmistakable sound of a lock sliding shut. The basement wasn't just storage, it was a prison. They were trapped, and above them, the poisoning had begun. Daniel Coleman opened the feast with a long, rambling sermon about sacrifice and spiritual cleansing. As the meal began, people noticed the food tasted strange, bitter, and metallic. Some began to feel dizzy, others clutched their stomachs in pain. The elderly collapsed first. Then Timothy Walsh, the boy who had once overheard Coleman family secrets, sounded the alarm. He had seen Rebecca sprinkle a white powder into the serving pots. His cry, "They're poisoning us," ripped through the crowd, and panic followed. The Colemans reacted instantly. Joshua pulled a rifle from behind the podium. Ezra slammed a heavy bar across the exit. Sarah Coleman began attacking anyone who tried to flee, but they hadn't anticipated how hard people would fight when faced with death. Margaret and Sarah had already begun moving people toward windows and side doors. Many, despite the poison taking hold, fought back. Chaos erupted. The once quiet hall became a war zone. Screams, shattered glass, and the smell of smoke filled the air. Trapped below, Anna and David heard everything. Desperate to escape, they searched until they found a narrow coal chute leading outside. It was barely wide enough, but they squeezed through, emerging into the cold night to find the main hall ablaze. The Colemans had set fire to the building hoping to destroy the evidence and everyone still alive, but their plan failed. People poured from the hallsome, dragging the wounded, others helping children. For the first time in years, the Coleman family wasn't in control. By morning, smoke rose from the ruins of New Canaan. The flames had been seen for miles, drawing nearby farmers and eventually the authorities. The horror that had been hidden for 15 years now stood exposed. Of the nearly 400 who once lived there, only 87 survived. The poison arsenic worked slowly, killing many even after they fled. Others died from injuries or exposure. Bodies were found days later in the woods, hidden by trees, but not forgotten. The Colemans met brutal ends. Daniel was found in his office, beaten to death by survivors. His eyes gouged out, perhaps by someone who feared the hold he still had over people. Sarah Coleman burned to death while trying to escape with a bag of gold, her body found with melted coins fused to her skin. Joshua tried to escape on horseback, but was caught by Margaret Foster's group. He stood trial and was publicly executed. Unrepentant to the end, Rebecca was pulled from the ruins, burned and dying. In a Cincinnati hospital, she confessed everything, including the locations of other communities. She died 3 weeks later. Her last words were a quiet plea for forgiveness that only Ezra escaped. He fled into the woods, and though he was never seen again, some believe he survived, wandering from town to town, hiding, always afraid. The investigation that followed uncovered the full scope of the Colemans' crimes. Thanks to the records Anna found, authorities shut down similar communities in other states. Over 800 victims were confirmed killed or sold over to decades. The operation had generated a fortune, all built on deception, faith, and murder. The survivors tried to rebuild. Anna Thompson became an advocate, working to prevent future abuses. David Chen helped construct homes for those left homeless. Margaret and Sarah opened a school for the orphans. The land itself was abandoned. The buildings were torn down, and nature slowly took over. Still, stories persisted. Farmers heard voices in the night bells that no longer existed. Footsteps in the ashes. The official records were sealed. The world moved on. Many survivors changed their names and started over. The authorities, embarrassed by their inaction, let the story fade. But some things don't stay buried. Descendants told the story, and researchers kept digging. A lone stone marker stands in that valley now. It acknowledges something happened, but not the full truth. The final death toll was never confirmed. Many bodies were never recovered. The Colemans had been thorough when it came to hiding their crimes. Their financial records were detailed, but they left little behind about how they disposed of the dead. The story of New Canaan became legend, a warning whispered in church basements and passed quietly between generations. It shook the trust of thousands. The Second Great Awakening, once a source of hope, would always carry the stain of what happened there. Perhaps most disturbing was how easily the Colemans operated for so long. They used isolation, desperation, and the public's hesitation to interfere in religion to shield their crimes. Their story is a lesson in how power can be twisted when wrapped in the language of faith. Afterward, new laws were passed, inspections increased, reports of abuse were taken more seriously. But the vulnerabilities, poverty, fear, and the need to believe in something never disappeared. Timothy Walsh survived and became a minister himself, but he never forgot. His sermons warned of the evil that can hide behind a righteous face. In his final sermon before he died in 1903, he said, "Evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it comes in robes, speaking salvation, offering hope, and hiding the deepest darkness." Today, the stone in the valley stands mostly ignored. The inscription is worn down, barely readable, but on quiet nights, locals say you can still hear echoes, bells, voices, footsteps, reminders of what once was. The biggest question that remains is whether New Canaan was unique or just one part of something larger. Were the Colemans the only ones, or were they just the ones who got caught? What we do know is that on April 5, 1852, a long-hidden nightmare was finally dragged into the light. But the cost was immense. The survivors bore the weight of those memories for the rest of their lives, and their children still live with that legacy. The story of New Canaan isn't just history, it's a warning. Because every generation has its own Coleman's people who twist hope into control and faith into fear. The names change, the tools evolve, but the danger stays the same. So, what do you think happened to those who escaped that terrible night? Did every member of the Coleman family truly meet their end, or did some vanish into the shadows to continue their work? The records may be sealed, but the questions remain. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more hidden chapters of America's forgotten history. Until next time, remember, the scariest monsters are the ones who promise salvation.